I'm really pleased to be here with you and to participate in this series of discussions with journalists on key trade issues. You mentioned I'm the editor-in-chief of Trade Vistas. It's tradevistas.org, by the way. And it is, I want to mention, it is a nonpartisan, non-advocacy online publication. We're dedicated to engaging the public on how trade affects their lives, their jobs, their communities, the nation, and to generally make trade policy more accessible to non-experts. And it is also sponsored by the Heinrich Foundation, I should mention. So I'm grateful for their support as well. So the title of this program is What's Next for the WTO? And one of my other hats that I wear is that I teach at Georgetown, the master's program in foreign service, and I've done that for the last 15 years. But what I realized a few years ago was that you can't just teach the students what is, because you assume that that's what they're going to inherit in terms of trade policy and trade policy institutions. Instead, you really have to teach them how to innovate, right? Trade policy is an exercise in creativity, is what I say to them and what I believe being a trade practitioner. And what we're facing right now in the WTO is a kind of stasis, right? It's not serving its members well. It's leaving them to want to negotiate deals outside of the institution or to take measures outside of the WTO. But it also means that the trade rules are falling too far behind the modern global economy in areas like services and digital. And the rules were negotiated before China's entry, and they seem at this point inadequate to deal with China's pervasive state involvement in its own economy. So to move forward and to get to what's next in the WTO, I think you have to anchor yourself in founding principles, which is what you asked me to talk about. And I wanted to start with this polling because very few Americans are familiar with those principles, let alone how the WTO operates. So at Trade Vistas, we did some polling in July. And the reason that we decided to do the polling, I'm not sure if everybody is familiar with this, but the implementing bill, the bill to implement the WTO in the United States, it allowed for the Congress to assess the value of US participation in the WTO every 5 years. So anyone, a member in either house can offer a joint resolution of disapproval to effectively withdraw the United States from the WTO if enacted into law. Now, you'll see if you read it, procedurally the deck is stacked against a vote actually taking place, so it doesn't seem very likely. But the timing this year, as you all will know, it coincided with the US withdrawal from the WHO, which is one letter off as far as the American public is concerned, even though very different organizations. But I felt like the risk was higher than ever before, given the level of public distrust generally in international institutions and in public institutions in general. So we wanted to know what ordinary Americans thought about the WTO. So you can advance this, and I'll show you some of the results here. We asked if there was support, if people supported or opposed leaving the WTO. And the result of this was that 36% supported, either strongly or somewhat supported, leaving the WTO. But another 17% were indifferent and 18% were unsure. So another 36% here were indifferent or unsure. So I sort of put these two numbers together and suggest that really only 28% of the respondents had either strong or even tepid support for staying in the WTO. So there's clearly an opening for detractors of the WTO. But optimistically, at least I like to look at it optimistically, when people feel that they understand the role of the WTO, they're more likely to be supportive of it and more supportive of US membership in it. So for example, when you frame it as enforcing voluntarily agreed rules or as preventing foreign governments from being unfair to American businesses, the majority of people responding believe it does play that role. So if that's true, and you can go to the next slide, and if it's also true that most Americans, upwards of 80% of Americans, believe the US should lead the global economy, help the United States play that role. Here's where it gets a little bit shaky again, though, because among those who think we should leave, their answers tend to align with their belief that their earlier response that they think we should leave the WTO. So they don't think leaving diminishes our ability to lead. But 31% didn't think leaving would make a difference, or they were unsure. Only 23% responded that it would hurt the US standing. So I think, these are not shocking or surprising numbers necessarily, but I think what it shows is there isn't necessarily a groundswell or a strong movement to leave the WTO. Mostly people are unsure of what it does, right? They're unsure of the value proposition, and that includes the younger respondents, which I think is troubling, and it's a key audience for us at Trade Vistas. So I think it comes down to, how do we help the American public and the global public understand the organization, what the agreement is about, and would that understanding reduce the general distrust toward the WTO and other institutions these days? So I think you could take those slides away. And what you asked me to talk about substantively now was what the WTO does, and we can't go through every aspect of that. I know people are probably familiar with its core functions, with dispute settlement, with negotiations, with its monitoring function, and each is important. But what I wanted to focus on was the basic contract of the WTO, right? The foundational principles, the core elements that I think if the general public understood better, and they would have faith that it aligns with our democratic free market philosophy, and they might be more inclined then to support it. So I'm going to go through very quickly, five core elements. And they're prevalent in the founding principles of the WTO, but you will find this in every free trade agreement. Here are the five things. One is procedural fairness and transparency. So the WTO has requirements for governments to consult with stakeholders on regulations and laws that affect people doing business in their country, to publish its regulations, to make them known, to be transparent in their processes. And we take those procedures for granted in the United States, but I think what's really underappreciated about the fact that they're embedded in the WTO and you have 194 members adhering to it is the significant pull-through. These are best practices, and it helps promote rule of law in the commercial arena in other countries. So this sense of procedural fairness, this is the pull-through of that is what enables traders around the world to do business overseas, right? To feel that they can do business overseas. They know what the rules of the game are. The other element here is non-discrimination. You've heard that a lot, but it's vital. What the WTO stands for and what's embedded throughout its rules is the principle of non-discrimination in two different forms, right? One is that members won't discriminate against imports from countries, from any country. So if I have a cell phone from South Korea, same cell phone from China, I won't discriminate between those imports. But I also won't, so national treatment is the other principle. I won't offer better treatment to American companies, for example, than I do companies that are importing. So national treatment, providing the same treatment for domestic products and services that you provide to imported, is an element of non-discrimination that is core to the WTO's operation. So if you overlay market access on those two things, the procedural fairness and the non-discrimination, then what you have is that those principles are applied in regulations and also to different forms of market access, procurement, tariffs, the ability to provide services. So market access is the third key element of what what governments agree to as part of the WTO. I think the fourth one that's also overlooked, that's really important to the way that Americans and others perceive the organization, is that it has always been built in from the beginning of GATT and WTO that there are exceptions, right? There are exceptions for reasons of national security, or to protect human health, plant health, animal health, or to protect exhaustible natural resources. And in those cases, there may be some type of discrimination necessary to achieve a legitimate public objective. But there are disciplines on that too, right? It has to be done in a least trade restrictive way possible, for example. So if Americans worry that international institutions threaten sovereignty, it's it's true that we voluntarily agree to procedural fairness. It's true that we agree to provide market access on a non-discriminatory basis. But you don't give up your right to regulate. And if there's a conflict, you can avail yourself of those exceptions when it's necessary and appropriate. So the last one that I want to touch on is just enforcement. This is just detail, but a great deal of what I just described ends up enshrined in domestic law and practice. But it's strongly normative at this point. That's another really underappreciated point, is that the rules about procedural fairness, non-discrimination, governments take that into account when they're developing regulations and implementing laws. It is largely normative, and that is a huge value of having the WTO operating in the background. But you also have the ability to pursue a violation through enforceable dispute settlement. And that's a key element of the WTO that is unique to the WTO among international organizations. So there's a lot more I could say, but I know you wanted me to stay at the 30,000 foot level. So I'm going to leave you with just those 5 points. But I want to just make a transitional point here, which is to say that the orientation that I just described, this procedural fairness, transparency, openness, reasonable exceptions to this generally free market orientation, and adherence to a binding contract that we entered into voluntarily, and that's for mutual benefit. If all of that sounds like the orientation generally of the United States, it is. So that is the key point, for Americans, is that the WTO really does reflect the way we operate, the way we do business. So if you're going to make a case to the American public, I think you have to point out that the WTO aligns with American goals of protecting fundamental economic freedoms, of having transparent rules and basic disciplines for basic fairness. So if it's faltering or failing to keep pace, we have the ability to negotiate necessary improvements if we demonstrate leadership, and then that would protect our own ability to control our destiny. So I know if all that's too amorphous, the other point you can make to Americans is that it provides a counterpoint to China, right? And I know we're going to get deeper into that. The WTO promotes and spreads this commitment, right, to free market and democratic ideals. China stands for something other than free market democratic ideals. So it really comes down to who will influence most the rules of this system. And I think that's a transition. I'm going to tee that up now for Bryce and Jennifer to talk about, if it's Trump too, or if it's Biden. When you view the WTO, a lot of this is going to come down to, do you let it go fallow and become an instrument for the Chinese government, or do you engage and negotiate and reform it? So I'll leave it there and we can continue the conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Andrea, for that a really helpful nuts and bolts introduction to why we should care about the WTO. And journalists out there, I'd just like to put in a mention that Andrea is a wonderful source in her ability to explain very, very complicated issues in English. So her Twitter was in the invitation, and you feel free to reach out to her when the going gets really hoary there. So now I'd like to turn it over to Jennifer. Jennifer is, as she will tell you, is an advisor to the Biden campaign, but has agreed to come on in her personal capacity. So nothing she says here is, connected to the Biden campaign. But we're really grateful to have her because she is such an expert and a veteran. And I'd just like to mention that she's also appeared a number of times before to brief journalists at the National Press Foundation, and her previous videos, as well as all the resources from this program, can be found on our website, nationalpress.org. You'll find Andrea's articles as well as Jennifer's previous videos and some of Bryce's coverage as well. So Jennifer, thank you so much. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Sunny. And it is really a delight and an honor to be here and to follow on Andrea's, I think, very, very crisp and clear presentation. I also really do want to join her in thanking the National Press Foundation for all it's doing to try to build understanding around these very complicated trade issues. So I do want to talk a little bit about what's going to happen on the trade policy front either if President Trump were to be reelected or if there were to be a Biden administration. But as Sunny noted, I want to be very clear that I am in no way speaking for the Biden campaign. What I would reflect is simply what Vice President Biden has already said, either when he was the vice president or on the campaign trail. And similarly, anything about the Trump administration, I'm drawing from the president's actual words or actions. So what should we expect if Trump is reelected? I think the answer is mostly more of the same. Which means at least four of the following, I think, important things. First, I think what you would see is a continuation of and possibly additional unilateral tariffs. And when I say unilateral tariffs, I think it's important to understand that that means that they are illegal under the WTO's rules. I think you can see President Trump has repeatedly described himself as the tariff man, and has also repeatedly said, and I would note erroneously, that somehow it's foreigners that pay for these tariffs, when in reality tariffs are paid by the American importers that are bringing the goods in. But there's no question that President Trump likes and favors tariffs. So I think we can expect more tariffs. Despite the fact that I think, in my view, the tariffs that we have in place have not done what they were purported to do. They have not made our steel or our aluminum industries more vibrant or improved our national security. They have not brought about significant change in China's unfair trading practices. And because they violate our WTO obligations to charge no more in tariffs than we agreed to in our tariff schedule, they are promoting a sense of kind of lawlessness and chaos in the trading system. I mean, at its very core, for example, the United States agreed through a series of negotiations to charge a tariff of no more than 0% on imports of steel. And yet one of the first acts that the Trump administration took was, through the result of this national security investigation, to start charging a 25% tariff on all steel imports. So again, an immediate notion that the Trump administration favors tariffs even when they're not legal, even when they're imposed in this unilateral way. I think the second thing we could expect from a Trump administration is a continuing disdain for multilateral organizations, including the WTO, and for multilateral rules. I think if you look at it, the president has threatened on and off that the United States would withdraw from the WTO. Hence the reason I think that you see this in Andrea's polling, that there has been this consistent threat of we need to pull out of the WTO, that the WTO has somehow been unfair to the United States, that the WTO has failed. I think the president continues to say that he will or may withdraw the United States, notwithstanding the fact that it would take an act of Congress to do that. He's clearly made it clear that his view is that the United States is better off with a might makes right sort of power-based trading system rather than one that's based on rules. To me, the truth is that we need the WTO and its rules-based system for a number of reasons, but the two most important ones are, I'm going to piggyback on what Andrea has said, is that it protects American goods, farm products, services, intellectual property rights from being discriminated against in foreign markets. No one can decide that they want to impose a higher tariff or bar American goods just because they're American. I mean, you can't just say, okay, I don't like America for this reason or that reason, and therefore I'm going to put restraints on American goods. Secondly, to me, the WTO provides stability and predictability to everyone. Among, to me, the many problems with the Trump administration's policies have been the uncertainty of them. No one knows whether tariffs are going to be imposed, whether there's going to be exclusions from the tariffs granted or not, whether changes will be made. And everyone, therefore, has less confidence to make long-term contracts or investments. And these decisions often disrupt trade by imposing tariffs on goods that are already on the water, already under contract before you even knew about it. The third thing I think that you can expect from a Trump administration is the continuation of approaching trade largely through bilateral or unilateral approaches. And that means fundamentally smaller trade deals that are not nearly as comprehensive as a broader multilateral agreement might be. And secondly, this going small, going unilateral means that the U.S. will continue to cede leadership, particularly to China. While you've seen some cutbacks recently from China. China is unequivocally moving ahead with its massive Belt and Road Initiative and its efforts at regional trade agreements through RCEP and others, and by ensuring that Chinese nationals have prominent roles in the WTO and other multilateral organizations. And fourth, I would say with respect to the WTO's dispute settlement system, a Trump re-election means a semi-permanent end to the WTO appellate body, and with it to, I think, the binding rules-based system. I think ever since May of 2017, when the United States began blocking the appointment of new members to sit on the appellate body and extensively outlining a lot of long-standing U.S. concerns, our trading partners have been asking the basic question: is the goal of the United States to reform the appellate body or to destroy it? And I think this summer we've gotten a very clear answer. For the Trump administration, the goal is to kill the appellate body. I think you see the response of the rest of the world is both great frustration with the United States and a decision to move ahead without us. So you've seen 22 countries, including the EU, China, Canada, Mexico, others, form what they're calling a multi-party interim arbitration arrangement to try to do this notion of appeals under an arbitration process, which again has a lot of great potential, but fundamentally doesn't bind countries like the United States that refuse to be a party to it. So what would change if there were a Biden administration? And again, I want to remind everyone, I am not speaking for the Biden campaign, but I would think you would see at least three very significant changes. First, I would expect a Biden administration to support a reformed WTO and the rules-based system that goes with it. I would expect a Biden administration to fully engage in the process of reforming and revitalizing the WTO, including its dispute settlement system. I think you hear very clearly Vice President recognizing the critical role that the United States has played, both in forming the WTO at its beginning and his desire to work with allies to confront China. And that means including through the WTO and the WTO dispute settlement system. I would imagine the Biden administration to also use the WTO as a key forum to work with allies to achieve agreements on a number of the critical issues that are pending before the WTO right now. And that includes everything from getting disciplines on fisheries subsidies that are leading to overfishing and depleting our oceans, to new global rules governing e-commerce and digital trade, but also to use the WTO as a place to pursue his objectives of including protections for workers, for the environment, and for public health in a broader trade agenda. I would also see a Biden administration using efforts to reform and revitalize the WTO as part of its work to dampen the amount of chaos that we're now seeing in the trading system. Secondly, I would expect the Biden administration to really emphasize a recognition between a linkage on investments at home and trade policy abroad, with Vice President Biden already making it clear that he does not favor new trade agreements until investments are made in infrastructure, technology, and training so that American workers are given the tools that they need to compete in the 21st century. I think you've clearly seen Vice President Biden's statements on that, and it is a recognition of how out of step the United States is with much of the rest of the developed world. I mean, if you look, for example, at the amount of spending on long-term worker training, investment in our workers, in worker healthcare, in worker training, in worker development, most of the rest of the OECD countries spend between 2 and 3% of their entire GDP on that long-term worker support. In the United States, the number is 0.27%. We simply are not investing in our workers or giving them the tools that they need to be competitive in a globalized trade world. And I think that is one of the clear things that where I think you would see a change between the Trump administration and a Biden administration. And the third big change that I think you would see if Biden administration were to come in is work to restore trust in America that has been lost under President Trump. I think very few of our trading partners believe that they can trust us. I mean, if you look at it, the ink was hardly dry on the USMCA before President Trump threatened to put new tariffs on all goods coming in from Mexico over immigration issues. I mean, if we look more recently, less than a month after the USMCA entered into force just this July, the Trump administration reimposed tariffs on aluminum coming in from Canada, and it required an enhanced monitoring of steel exports coming out of Mexico. If you flip to looking at what's happened with China, when the initial 301 reports came out saying China is to be condemned for its theft of intellectual property, its forced technology transfers, and at some level for the sort of subsidies and state-owned enterprises and a lot of other unfair trading practices, the rest of the world agreed with the United States that we were right. But what did the Trump administration then do? They went and cut a deal that at its heart simply says all you need to do to get out of this China is buy more American goods, $200 billion worth more of American goods, which basically means buy less of everybody else's goods. So immediately the rest of the world is sort of set aside, pushed away from this idea of joining with the United States to go after China. So again, I think the broad message from a Biden administration would be to work to restore that kind of trust. At the WTO, in particular, I think you see the U.S. has put forward a number of proposals, some of which were even begun under the Obama administration, to alter the notion that countries can self-declare themselves to be developing countries in order to get special and differential treatment. You've seen the U.S. put forward proposals on transparency and the need to make countries be accountable to their requirement to provide notifications of everything from subsidies to trade barriers. But the proposals have been greeted with some degree of suspicion about whether the United States is really out to undermine the WTO, given its singular willingness to take down the appellate body with no plans to fix it or to engage in it. So I think a Biden administration would work very hard to restore faith that you can take the United States at its word, and that when the United States puts trade proposals on the table, it's doing so in good faith to restore a better trading system for all. So while there may be a lot of overlaps, I think at its core, the approach of a Biden administration versus the Trump administration would be quite different. And you see that most directly at the WTO in the notion that I think a Trump administration has had little faith in the multilateral system, whereas I think a Biden administration believes first and foremost in working with allies, with multilateral institutions, and fundamentally a belief in a rules-based system. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Jennifer, for that excellent wrap up. I want to just tell people who are joining the call late, because I know we had a bit of a Zoom problem this morning, that this is being recorded. It will be up on our website at nationalpress.org, and we will also have a transcript. So if you missed the first part, not to worry, and there will be plenty of time at the end for questions and debate. So now I'd like to turn it over to Bryce Bashuk, who's joining us from Bloomberg in Geneva. Bryce has been really tearing up the turf there, and a lot of people in the trade world depend on his reporting. So first, we're going to ask him to explain the very confusing standoff failure to be able to select a new leader for the WTO and what's next. And we'll discuss that. And then after that, journalists on the call, we're going to come back to Bryce for his tips about how to be awesome and how to best cover this if you are a US-based reporter who now suddenly needs to get smart about what's actually going on in Geneva that didn't used to matter and now you need to know. So with that, I'll turn it over. Bryce, thanks so much for joining us. And great Swiss view there, by the way.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's Switzerland's a tough place to be stuck these days. It's the view is not too bad. I really appreciate you including me on this panel with experts like Jennifer and Andrea. This is an honor, and thank you very much. Just gonna kind of give my insights into what's happening here in Geneva. You know, there was a lot of talk about the chaos at the organization. It certainly has slid into dysfunction, especially over the past 3 years. Andrea was talking about the three primary functions: dispute settlement, negotiation, and trade monitoring. And almost all three of those are pretty much frozen. Some work happens here, but it's certainly not operating on all cylinders. So thrown into that, sense of dysfunction, in May, the Director General, who is the foremost official at the WTO, decided that he would step down from his post a year early. He cited reasons that he just really was ready to move on, and today starts his job at PepsiCo in New York. So with all this dysfunction, we now have a leaderless organization. Members in July were unable to agree on an interim Director General. So it's literally a leaderless organization, which is not particularly problematic because there wasn't too much going on here anyhow, but it's not a good thing. There are 8 candidates who have thrown their name into the ring to be the next Director General. They started their campaigns in July, came to Geneva, introduced themselves to the delegates here, answered questions about their ideas for reforming the organization and about their background, and then faced the media as well. It was a pretty fast and furious week, and we got to know some of the folks who want to help steer this sinking ship. At the end of the Q&A, there was a sense that 2 of the candidates who are likely to garner the most interest are 2 African women, Amina Mohammed from Kenya and Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala from Nigeria. Now, a selection process to basically winnow down these 8 candidates will officially start this month. The candidates are still campaigning. They're going out and talking to capital level officials, basically explaining, how they hope to reform the organization and answering any questions that officials may have. U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer has met with all the candidates, and he is not saying a word about which one he prefers. In fact, you're going to see a lot of that from some of the higher level officials in Europe, Asia, and the US. They won't say who they want because that could actually be detrimental to their favored pick. The reason for that is decisions at the WTO are made on the basis of consensus. That means that all 164 members have to agree in order for something to advance. And on the flip side, any member can oppose any candidate for any reason whatsoever. So that has resulted in this dynamic where you'll see the candidates interviewing in newspapers, and they don't really say anything particularly newsworthy, and that's intentional. They are very, very careful to not want to upset the major players at the WTO. I'm thinking specifically of the United States and China. So that's kind of the state of play there. Beginning on September 7th, there is a group of WTO officials called the Troika. There are 3 individuals who hold the highest ranking committee chairs. They are going to hold a series of confidential meetings with delegates to talk about which candidates that nations believe will garner the most consensus to be the next Director General. This is a totally secret process behind closed doors. None of the information is intended to get out. The idea is to basically protect the dignity of the candidates, who will be slowly whittled down into 3 phases. We start at 8. After this first consultation, it will be 3 candidates will be cut or asked to step back, leaving 5. Another 3 candidates will be asked to step back from the race, leaving 2. And then members will be faced with the decision of which final candidate they want to select to be the next Director General. The expected timeline for that decision is November 7th. However, that's not set in stone, and there is the small issue of a US election between now and then. So things may be extended. Right now, it's about as clear as mud. The second thing I wanted to talk about was why this is important for countries like the United States and China. I believe Jennifer alluded to the idea that the US and China are in a bit of a turf war in international organizations. Both are trying to put officials at high-level international organizations that they feel would best represent their interests. The Chinese have been doing this somewhat successfully for years. They have 3 heads of international organizations: the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, the FAO, and the International Civil Aviation Authority. The US, the Trump administration has sought to counter that. This year, they successfully displaced a candidate who is seeking to be the leader of the World Intellectual Property Organization, which is just up the road from the WTO. And I think it's safe to say that the US would want to have a candidate at the WTO that best represents Robert Lighthizer' vision for fundamental reform, for addressing China's excesses, and the third condition he has is they can't be anti-American. So that's kind of the state of play here in Geneva, and why it means so much to the US and China. Happy to answer any questions you may have.
Okay, Bryce, I would like to just ask one question at the beginning, and that is, U.S. Trade Representative Lighthizer recently wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal in which he laid out kind of his vision for reforming the WTO. Is it your sense that if the United States, and I understand this is a big if because there's gridlock with China, if the U.S. were to prevail and get its preferred candidate, whoever that person actually is, through, whether it's a Biden candidate or a Trump-favored candidate, how would you rate the WTO's ability to actually enforce fairly in this very messy landscape, to enforce trade rules? In other words, it's one thing to have a head that is perhaps favorable, or even if the US and China were to strike a deal over the new head, it's another thing to actually have an enforcement mechanism. You cover this. How would you rate the WTO's ability to be an effective enforcer of whatever is agreed upon?
I'm glad you asked that question. The Director General of the WTO is not, it actually doesn't have that much power. It's not like being a president or a prime minister. It's more like being a maitre d' at a restaurant. The WTO is run by its members. There's 164 nations. They set the agenda, they discuss negotiations, they settle the agreements, and the Director General's role is really more to facilitate that. He or she can, organize meetings among members, can make statements in the press, and if there are disagreements, occasionally they can use their good offices to try to address those in a way that is amenable to everybody. So that said, the next Director General won't really have much power to settle these kind of massive geopolitical disagreements we're seeing play out at the WTO. The US-China trade conflict will not be settled by any of these Director Generals, as qualified and as experienced as they may be. Having a good listener and someone who can help rebuild that kind of trust that Jennifer was talking about, that's really the kind of qualities that delegates are looking for, that kind of basically set the stage and kind of decompress a lot of the rhetoric that's we've seen in the past 3 years.
Okay, well, thank you so much. So one last question. Everybody, please get your questions ready. You can put them in the Q&A. You can also upvote or downvote questions you most want answered on Zoom, and you can raise your Zoom hand if you want to be called on the air. We're going to give preference to journalists, but we have lots of times for questions. I want to just ask one last question of Andrea, and I guess Andrea first, and then Jennifer. So Bryce has described very ably an opaque process and organizational drift, which we presume is going to go on for a while, at least until after the US election, possibly longer. Who benefits from the current state of organizational drift? Who wins from gridlock?
Well, I think that's a pretty easy question, actually. To me, the winner is China. Look, I think, Bryce pointed this out, and I don't think it's too stark to say that China is working to remake the international organization landscape in its own image, to exert a high level of influence and Bryce described a few of the organizations that China is now the head of. It's unprecedented to have one country head that many economic-oriented international institutions. And if you look at the suite of those things, you mentioned civil aviation, you mentioned telecoms, but also something called the Industrial Development Organization, the UN Industrial Development Organization, as well as the FAO. So when I look across this suite of institutions that they're now heading, I see that it aligns really well with a desire to secure access to resources, to exert influence in developing countries, and you have to spend the treasury of China, you don't have access to the funds of these international organizations, and also to shape the global regulatory environment in key areas like the civil aviation, the telecommunications, and boldly went after WIPO, the Intellectual Property Organization. So I think that it's very strategic. I think it should be now fairly obvious to us. I don't think that the membership is going to support a direct Chinese candidate in the WTO, but the idea, to me, I think the goal would be for China to kind of neutralize the impact of the WTO's ability to constrain its own approach to economic growth and to intervention in its own economy, right? So if there's stasis, if there's a lack of agreement or ability to move forward, that means that there also won't be necessarily new disciplines in the area of subsidies, disciplines on its approach to state-owned, investing in its own and directing its own state-owned enterprises. And that is clearly to the benefit of the Chinese government.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Andrea, we're getting a lot of questions. I'm going to give the first one, I'm sorry, Jennifer, I'm going to give the first question to you
Sure.
on, this is on the Appellation Body overreach. So the questioner wants to know what's going to happen if Biden wins on some of these questionable decisions, like the introduction of the stare decisis doctrine, interpretation of the term public body, constant advisory opinions, among others. And I'd just like to mention that for those who are joining late, that Jennifer Hillman's briefing on the appellate body itself is available on our website if you need background so that you can understand the answer she's about to give. Jennifer, thanks.
Sure. Well, clearly a lot of what the U.S. has been complaining about have been complaints that have been brought for a long period of time. So it isn't, these did not start with the Trump administration, and so my view is they will not end with the Trump administration. I mean, the Obama administration, so that means the Obama-Biden administration, started, again, this notion of we really have to push back on some of the things that the appellate body has done that the United States thinks is not in contravention with at least the understanding of what the appellate body was supposed to do. So the issues themselves are not new. What is new is that the Trump administration has taken it to this extreme position of saying we're going to block all appointments to the appellate body such that the appellate body no longer has enough members to decide any cases. So it's effectively shut down the appellate body system. That did something really important, which is, I think, bring everyone in Geneva's attention very clearly on the U.S. complaints. I mean, in other words, for the first time, really, I think all members of the WTO started hearing it, that there were this serious complaints. Out of that grew a process to try to address the United States' reforms, headed ultimately by Ambassador David Walker from New Zealand, who put together a whole set of sort of, if you will, new operating principles that the WTO the appellate body could live by that would go a very long way to addressing the United States' concerns. The problem was at that point, the United States sort of disengaged in the process and basically didn't really react in any real substantive way to those Walker principles or to the rest of the process, and it basically just stayed out of it. So again, we now come to this view that the United States on the one hand has, if you will, legitimate concerns and that there has been a legitimate effort in Geneva to address them, but the United States is now taking this position of sort of, nothing is good enough. We simply want to kill the system. So Where this is headed, I think, again, would depend on the results of the election. I think a Trump administration will stay where it is, which is we simply want to kill the appellate body. We don't want an appeal system. We don't want a binding dispute settlement system. We want to be able to block any results that we don't like. I think without a recognition that if you do that, so can the others. In other words, when we win cases against China, China can do the same thing, block the adoption of the reports. So, again, I think it will take serious engagement. And again, I think at this point, the world was willing to engage with the United States. How long the rest of the world will be willing to now stay? I mean, in other words, how long will this leverage that the United States has created last? I think is hard to judge. I mean, Bryce may have a better sense of that, but I think, going into this Walker process, there was a lot of leverage and a lot of willingness by other countries to hear the United States and to try to figure out a fix. I don't know whether that will still be the mood in Geneva of we need to fix the appellate body, or whether the creation of this multi-party interim arrangement, everyone is going to sort of move over to saying, well, let's just do it through arbitration and leave the United States out. I think that's a little bit hard to judge. Again, I think if nothing happens, the U.S. will have squandered a significant amount of leverage that it created and a significant amount of engagement by the rest of the world to really hear the United States' concerns, I think will go by the wayside.
We have a question from a reporter, Kat Lucero from MLEX. I guess this one may be for you, Jennifer, but Andrea, you may want to weigh in. If Biden becomes president, how likely would the EU and the US be to settle the Boeing Airbus dispute at the WTO? Leaving aside China for a minute.
Right.
Well, this is obviously a hugely long-standing dispute, and there have been multiple efforts at multiple times across this entire set of disputes to try to figure out a solution. I mean, for those of you that don't know, this is a long-standing complaint where the United States is saying the entire creation of Airbus and the launch of every single new model of Airbus airplane is unfair because it was all done on the backs of very significant subsidies granted by Germany, France, the United Kingdom, and Spain. And so there's an argument that trade in subsidized goods is unfair because it's asking the United States to compete against goods that are unfairly subsidized. And of course, then immediately the Europeans turn around and say, oh, wait a minute here. Boeing got a whole series of subsidies, largely through research and development and military contracts, where a lot of the technology, from everything from quieter landing gear to different kind of fuselage constructions, et cetera, came out of research money granted to the military side of Boeing that can then transfer over to the civilian side of Boeing aircraft, along with a number of other subsidies. So the argument is, Europe is saying, United States, you unfairly subsidized Boeing, U.S. saying, that Europe unfairly subsidized Airbus. Long dispute. But I think at its core, I do think there is a recognition in the Biden administration of, while this whole long fight has been going on, what has also been happening is the Canadians, the Brazilians, and the Chinese have been developing their own aircraft industries. So while we keep doing this bilateral fighting, everybody else is winning by being able to, again, develop their very large aircraft industries as well. And so I think the understanding is, by far, the best solution to all of this is to get everybody together to agree on a more global agreement on exactly what, where, when, and how much can one subsidize the production of aircraft. And if you could come up with, again, a broader agreement of an understanding of exactly where the limits are, that would be a far, far preferable approach. How likely is it? I think it's still got to be in the unlikely category, given how long-standing this dispute has been. But I think that would be more likely an approach that a Biden administration would want to take.
Bryce, quick question for you, and then I'm going to turn it over to some of our international folks on the line. We've got people registered actually on this call from 33 countries, I'm told. So that's, I think, a new record for NPF. But I'd like to go back, Bryce. The question coming in, I think, for you is, so who is China supporting? in the race for Director General, or are they also being mum about it so as not to trigger U.S. animosity and U.S. rejection of their candidate as well?
That's an easy question. I have no idea, and they're definitely not going to tell me.
Okay.
China, just like the United States, I think if they put their endorsement on any one candidate, it's the kiss of death. You're going to get a veto from, the other nation. So you won't hear mum from either of them.
Okay, thank you so much. All righty, I'd like to turn it over, open the line to Muhammad Khan, who is calling in from Pakistan. Muhammad, can you unmute yourself?
Thank you, Sonny. And the question that I have is regarding China's ambitious Belt and Road project. So huge investments in not only Central Asian republics and Afghanistan, Pakistan, but also in African countries. So that economic leverage that China is going to get is also likely to turn into, its support in terms of turning reliance of the companies, of the countries from maybe previously in the Western-backed US bloc towards Chinese bloc, for example, Iran, Syria, and a number of African countries and Central Asian republics, Pakistan, Afghanistan. So what do you think is going to be the future of this Belt and Road Initiative and its flagship project, CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor? And is it going to be something which is hugely successful for China, or it is something which is not going to pose any danger to the Western bloc or to the US? Thank you.
I mean, I can start. I think it's too early to tell which way this is going to go. There's no question that the Belt and Road Initiative is very huge, both in terms of the dollar value, in terms of the breadth of what it's attempting to do, in terms of, if you look at it, sort of more than 80% of the funding so far has gone into infrastructure like transportation and energy. So it is the creator of the roads, the ports, the energy facilities in its many countries. And again, there's a huge swath of the world that is in some way connected into the Belt and Road Initiative. So in that sense, I think this is China stepping out onto the world stage in a very big way and trying to show, its command of the ability to do a lot of this. And at the same time, you're starting to see a number of pushbacks in a number of countries. There's a lot of concern about the level of debt. I mean, most of the lending that is being done for these projects is being done on relatively significant commercial terms, which means these countries are taking on a significant amount of debt. You're starting to see some defaults, some pushbacks, some concerns over that. You're also starting to see some complaints about the quality of the process and of the actual construction that's occurring. So again, whether it ends up leaving China looking really good at the end of this and creating this very large sphere of economic power and influence, or whether it leaves a very bad taste in countries' mouths, depending on how the projects go, I think it's a little too early to tell. Certainly the early indications are that many countries are in desperate need of this kind of infrastructure spending. It has clearly created a bit of a push or tension on the World Bank, the IMF, and on other countries' developmental lending to try to figure out what's the appropriate response for the rest of the world to think about it. But it has given China an entree into places that it has not been before. It has given it connections that we haven't seen before. And I think the question speaks to how dangerous this could be. And on the other hand, how helpful a lot of this infrastructure development may be to many countries that are in much need of it.
Okay, thank you. All right, we have a question from Argentina. Julieta Zelkovic, excuse me if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, Julieta wants to know, if Biden were elected, will these hard topics like agricultural market access or fishery subsidies gain momentum in negotiations? Andrea, do you want to take that one on the specific sectoral battles that we're seeing now raging around the world, since you've written on some of these?
Yeah, I don't know that this is necessarily a Republican or Democrat. The reason for, the inability to move forward, I don't think has a lot to do with it, which party is in power in the United States. It spans such a long period of time that it really has more to do with you know, the political economy of trying to negotiate this stuff in general, right? So there are always extreme sensitivities in certain sectors, in fisheries and agriculture. No matter which sector you look at, there are always extreme sensitivities in these. They're hard to negotiate. I do think there's, you know, a dynamic that's developed over the years in the WTO that's really unhelpful, which is that, you know, in Doha, for example, it was the tail wagging the dog in terms of trying to negotiate. So this dynamic between who's developed, who's developing, therefore, what kind of flexibilities can I take? How long can I take to implement? You know, all of these dynamics of how can I get out of the commitments before I even know exactly what my commitments are has been I think a dynamic that's plagued the negotiations in every sector for 20 years now. So we've got to figure out how to break that dynamic. And I don't think that it's a party issue. I think that's something that just bold leaders who can articulate and try to get the countries participating in the negotiations to really focus on the end goal and the benefits of liberalization and agree on that, agree on a set of commitments before you start figuring out what flexibilities might be needed to implement. That's a question of political will, of leadership, of good communication, and not really one of politics, I think.
Okay, thank you. Bryce, while we've got you, this is a question that will come up in our next webinar, our next program on September 22nd on national security and data. Well, while we've got you, I have a quick question about the TikTok and WeChat dispute and how that might play out at the WTO. Could China file a complaint against the US at the WTO for blocking or forcing the sale or blocking these companies? And if so, I granted it would take a long time for this to work through the process with the gridlock, but would there be, in your view, PR value? Do you expect to see China appearing at the WTO and complaining about US blocking of Chinese investments on national security grounds?
Sure, good question. Well, that's two questions. The first is, could China do this? Yes, China could do this. I believe they are considering filing a dispute. I think the grounds would be this would be a violation of national treatment, whereas the U.S. is favoring its technology companies over Chinese technology companies. Will China file a dispute? I don't know. That's where this whole debate about the effect of the appellate body blockage is affecting how countries address trade disputes. China knows that if it wins a dispute against the U.S., all the U.S. has to do to make it go away is to appeal it into a legal void. So it will have spent 3 years, I don't know how much money, on lawyers in Geneva debating this issue to get a result which will essentially not help them at all, other than just say, hey, look, we were right. So they could do that. They could file a dispute just so they have the, a ruling that could potentially favor them. I don't know if it would favor them. But at the same time, they could address this in a bilateral fashion, and much in the way that the U.S. has done with intellectual property disputes against China. It has filed unilateral measures through Section 301 of U.S. trade law to basically skip the whole WTO process and then go straight to the sanctions. So you may see a dual effort there. Right now, I think it's too soon to say.
Okay, thank you. Okay, journalists, we've got we're ending shortly, but we'll take a last round of questions. You can put them in chat or raise your hand. We've got one last one. Question for the panel from Alistair Scarf, Head of Country Risk for Bank of America in the Asia Pacific. This one is on India. Can you comment on India's role and behavior toward reforms at the WTO? Is India being a fair and reasonable stakeholder? Anybody want to take that one? That's a pretty broad question. Andrea, do you have anything to say on India's behavior?
Well, I'll leave the on-the-ground observations to Bryce because I haven't been in Geneva in a while. But I will say that in general, I think that what should be on the table in discussing WTO reform And what a next DG needs to do is to really look at the way the WTO operates. It's wonderful that we have been able to operate largely on consensus for a long time, but on this, by the same token, it hasn't allowed us to make significant progress in the negotiations. And we've seen that, a vote of one, an objection by one, and that is often India, has really stymied the ability to reach some significant agreements over the years. And I just wonder whether it's time to look at other ways of achieving progress in the WTO, at least under some circumstances, if not for everything. Would there be a reasonable, situation where it would be reasonable to go with the majority, to take a vote, to do things a little bit differently so that one country, which is just so happens to often be India, can't block progress for everybody else?
Okay, well, thank you for that. All right, I'm going to turn this over to Bryce for some on-the-ground help for journalists. Since we are the National Press Foundation, our motto is "We make good journalists better." So Bryce, we have a lot of people covering this for the first time. We have thank you for the background about what's going on at the WTO and the race that's coming and the organizational drift. What advice can you give U.S. and Asian correspondents, people who are not in Geneva, for how to report better on these issues and how to explain these things to the rest of the world in the way that you've been able to do so well?
Sure. I think a key to this beat is persistence. It is a very secretive organization. A lot of the meetings take place without any sort of announcements, and there won't be, too many readouts that are very detailed. If there are developments that are negative, that's not something this organization likes to broadcast in any way. So a key to covering this beat is really shoe leather journalism. Unfortunately, you really do have to be here in Geneva to cover it very closely. If you're not in Geneva, I would say the best tips I can offer are, sign up for the WTO press newsletter. Make sure you're in contact with their press shop, which is fantastic. They have a great team there. They're very honest and candid, and they will walk you through what is a very detailed and technical organization. I really recommend reaching out to them. They have a great team. There is a resource that the WTO has called Documents Online. If you know how to set a news alert, I would set an alert so you get an email anytime that a new document pops up. It's a great way to learn, what exactly is happening at this moment, what issues members are focused on. You're not going to get a lot of news out of it, but every now and then there's a gem. I think another great resource I would recommend is the Geneva-based International Trade Center. They have a really fantastic what's called a trade map, where you can really boil down the data as to which countries trade, what products and where global trade flows are headed and what tariff rates are. It's just really a fantastic resource, and they too have a great press shop if you want to reach out to them. I think other than that, reach out to your local Ministry of Trade or Foreign Affairs. They are really, really great resources. These people are very smart and been doing this for years. And I would say when you interact with these folks, just be really honest and candid. Say, I don't understand what's going on. Can you explain to me what's going on? And I've always been surprised at how helpful government officials have been in terms of catching people up.